YouTube live show.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Hong Kong Green Finance Association's Green Finance and the Data Center Industry webinar. My name is Chen Chen, Secretary General of HKGFA. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start, a few words on housekeeping. We will leave time for Q&A after the panel discussion, so if you have any questions, please share them in the Q&A box. This webinar is also eligible for CPT hours subject to employer approval. To claim your CPT certificate, please complete the survey at the end of this webinar. Thank you. On to today's webinar, which is organized by HKGFA's Product Innovation and Solutions Sustainable Finance Products Workstream and will feature two presentations followed by a panel discussion and a brief Q&A. The first presentation will be by Dorisha Miranda, who leads the Finance Engagement and Water Risk Valuation for China Water Risk. And Dorisha will provide an update on sustainability issues relating to the data center industry. This will be followed by a presentation from Jonathan Warbridge, Chief Financial Officer for Digital Edge, who will share with us how the industry is trying to address these challenges. We'll then move on to our panel session, which will be moderated by Ronald Young, Head of Sustainable Finance Asia at Societe Generale. Ronald is also the lead for HKGFA's Sustainable Finance Workstream, and joining him on the panel will be Dorisha, Jonathan, and Jason Chang, Associate Partner, Corporate Sustainability and Climate Change for ERM. So without further ado, I'll now pass the time to Dorisha. Over to you, Dorisha.
Thanks, Chen. And hopefully everyone can see my slide. So I'm just going to be talking through quite briefly on rising data center emissions and how the ICT sector could actually become is a good green finance opportunity. For those of you who don't know CWR, we're a think tank based in Hong Kong, and for the last decade, we've been pushing the water risk valuation conversation and helping finance and corporates navigate the escalating new climate reality. So we help banks, institutional investors, as well as corporates assess and strategize and adapt for these risks. So you might be wondering why I'm going to be talking maybe about water, given that we're water people, why I'm maybe going to be talking about carbon, sorry. And that's because of how fast things are moving. So this was the target we set ourselves in 2015 in Paris. The world's leaders or political leaders came up with this, saying, let's do our best to try and stick to 1.5 degrees of global warming by 2100. The reality is that we're going to get there much earlier than expected. And this isn't a good thing. You know, normally when you're beating a target, that's good. This is very bad because the risks that we thought we were going to feel in 2100, we're already starting to feel today. So in 2023, actually, this is how much warming we felt. And then within the year, these are the peaks that we also felt. And things have moved quite quickly because in 2022, we had only warmed by 1.15 degrees. And this is why water risks are accelerating, whether it's floods or droughts or wildfires, because water is how we feel climate change. Carbon is how we are causing it. Water is how we feel it. So the higher the emissions, the higher the temperatures, and then we're accelerating physical risks. Yet we're still emitting. New pledges and targets that governments have set could get us to 2.1 degrees by 2100. But current policies will only get us to 2.7. And actually, if you look at our emissions today, we're heading straight towards 4 degrees, which is not good. And so if we want to try and get to this 1.5 degree target, we actually need to see a 43% cut in emissions in the next 7 years, which is significant because that's the same emissions as China, the US, and the EU. That's how much we need to cut every year. So we need rapid cuts, and we think the ICT sector really can help deliver this. And that's because it's a significant user of electricity globally. And a lot of this is from data centers and 5G. It's one of the fastest growing power hungry and carbon intensive sectors. And it's a big contributor to GHGs. So comparing it to sectors that would technically be seen as quite dirty, aviation, which is about 2.5% of global GHGs, shipping is 3%, and data centers are about 2 to 4%. That at the moment is the same as the emissions of Japan and Germany. The problem is that it's actually potentially could get to 23% by 2030 because of the rise in AI, 5G, fintech, digital lifestyle. All of that could lead to this very significant jump in emissions from data centers. Just to kind of explain, where all these emissions coming from, and just to show you how power hungry just the internet is, we looked at Google. So there are on average about 8.5 billion searches on Google every day. And that is the same emissions from those 8.5 billion searches every day is the same as Laos for the year. So that's just from one day. For a year, just from Google searches, we are emitting the same as the UK and Nigeria's emissions for the year. Now, if we add AI to this, it goes up 5 times. So then it's not just the UK and Nigeria, but it's also Germany, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia's emissions just from Google searches with AI for the year. So ICT is very power hungry, but it's also actually very thirsty. And a lot of water goes into all of these Google searches and the data centers. We're actually going to be producing a report on this in April or May. So please watch this space. It'll be on our website free for anybody who is interested in it. So to cut carbon emissions plus save water, we need to start with the ICT sector. And we actually focused on China's ICT sector. And that's because it's very big. So this chart shows you global, the ICT sector, as well as countries in terms of their GDP. And you can see China's ICT sector's revenue is similar to South Korea and Spain's GDP. So it's pretty big. And then if you look at listed companies in China, they make up about 10% of the global ICT players that are listed. And then in terms of revenue, it's 16%. And within revenue, if you look at specific sectors within ICT, even bigger for certain sectors. So it's a key player globally. So what it does in terms of transition really does matter, especially because data center emissions are ballooning. And this, again, is we're looking at China numbers, but I think it would be similar elsewhere as well, given the growth rates we've been seeing. But this is what emissions were in 2020. This is how much they grew just in 1 year to 2021, and they're expected to balloon by 2.5% by 2030. By 2030, data center emissions in China will be the same as the UK's annual emissions. Now, this is what Bitcoin peak emissions are expected to be this year. And this is very similar to what 2021 data center emissions were. So to meet China's dual carbon target, it's not surprising then if we start seeing, and we've already started to see, data center emissions starting to be reined in on from a regulatory perspective. So we looked at all of this in quite a lot of detail in this report, which is available on our website. And we delved into 5 companies that are listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange: Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, China Mobile, and Xiaomi. And why we looked at these 5 is because they're quite large. They make up over a third of all of China's listed ICT sector in terms of market cap. And they're also over a fifth of the Hang Seng Index. Plus, their emissions are significant. Just these 5 companies have the same emissions as 2.5 times of Hong Kong. And then finally, these 5 actually started their journey trying to reduce their emissions, whether it's through different targets, putting in place carbon neutrality targets as well. They've actually started. And I think this is important, given that they've started, there's also a really big opportunity here in terms of green finance. So we looked at the 5 companies listed that I talked about against what the 5 Silicon Valley companies, FANG, are doing in terms of green bonds. So the 3 of these companies in China have almost $2.5 billion of green bonds. And if you look at these 3 from the US, they have almost 9 billion. So that itself is quite a big difference. But I think for us, what we found quite interesting is actually, if you look at the renewables numbers in here, it's 40 million here, but it's 2 billion here. That's quite a big difference. Of course, they are starting on their journey, and hence why this is a really good and impressive green finance opportunity. And I think that the main reason it hasn't quite got to that stage yet is because I don't think anyone realized how large the emissions are from the sector, but also how much they're growing. And then finally, it's just my final slide is looking at next steps. Very briefly is we need more people to fully appreciate and understand the topic and how much the emissions are growing in the sector. We need to engage the sector a lot more. We need to start prioritizing ICT as a transition sector, start thinking about taxonomy and how do we include ICT in the green taxonomy. And finally, disclosure. We need to get ICT included in scope 3 because right now it is not. And with that, I will end my presentation and hand back to Chun.
Thanks, Tarisha. That's some impressive research, and I appreciate you kind of highlighting that financing gap between which Chinese companies have compared to US ones. So now we'll pass the time over to Jonathan to share his insights from the industry. Jonathan, please.
Thanks very much. My name is Jonathan Warbridge, so I'm Chief Financial Officer of Digital Edge. For those of you who are not familiar with Digital Edge, we're a Singapore-based data center operator, a portfolio company of Stonepeak, which is, I guess, one of the world's largest infrastructure investors based out of the US, but with sort of a big presence here in Asia Pac. And then within Digital Edge, we've got a presence or operations under construction operations across 6 countries, a total of 17 data centers, and I guess sort of IT power under construction operation of about 500 megawatts. Firstly, thanks to everyone for your time today and for the invitation to participate on this panel. I've got a handful of slides which I'll go through. I guess just sort of reflecting on the presentation prior to me, it does highlight the challenge for us here as data center operators, just given sort of the current and then projected environmental impact. And I guess I'll sort of touch on how we've been looking at that from a Digital Edge perspective. But before I do, and I guess sort of framing things up, the whole ESG agenda is obviously one that has got a lot of focus within the sector, and rightly so. And I think that's coming from multiple dimensions. I think sort of first and foremost, just given the importance or sort of the environmental impact that data centers do have, particularly sort of from an energy consumption and a carbon footprint perspective. From a customer standpoint, and we went through sort of some of the customers here locally and also some of the US-based customers, they are incredibly focused on this. And I think certainly from our standpoint, when we're looking at a new project with some of these more sophisticated customers who are looking at larger deployments, amongst the first thing that are looking through their own diligence on us and their own diligence on prospective sites is that sort of ESG agenda. So I think it's very much now becoming a hygiene factor from a customer standpoint. It's also got cost implications on the positive and cost implications in terms of, I guess, the higher costs if you get the stuff wrong. So I think hence very much sort of front of mind for individuals such as myself coming from a finance standpoint. And then I guess in terms of sort of broader stakeholders and this, whether this is sort of licensed to operate and sort of local or federal government in the countries in which we operate, through to sort of our own end and equity investors, it's obviously very much sort of part of the conversation, and hence ones that we're looking at sort of being at the forefront of the agenda of. Just very quickly, and I'll sort of go through, I've got 5 slides here, so we'll go through them fairly quickly and then we can hopefully jump into sort of the panel. Here's a bunch of stats about Digital Edge, and I guess so the blue here is to indicate in a stylized way the countries we're in. I guess the important thing here is, and certainly from sort of an ESG standpoint, and particularly as we go on to talk about, I guess, sort of the renewable energy and sort of working up the value chain or the supply chain, Yeah, I guess having that sort of regional footprint is great, and it's great from a customer standpoint. When it comes to looking at sort of energy procurement, and particularly on sort of the green side, we are operating in very, very different sort of regulatory framework markets, very different power price environments, and I guess, you know, as a result, we do have to have a very tailored approach towards each of the markets in terms of actually how we ultimately thinking about that sort of supply chain on the on the procurement side. And we'll go through as part of sort of the panel conversation. I wouldn't suggest that we've got all the answers. I think we've got very much a sort of fair idea of what a lot of the questions are, and what a lot of the questions that the industry is sort of grappling with, and I think making sort of progress on that journey. But I think it is very much a journey, particularly when it comes to that sort of renewable power sourcing side. On the ESG side, more sort of generally, this will be our third year of publishing publishing the ESG reports. The next one will come out next month, so please go onto our website and read it. It takes a lot of work to put together, but I guess for the reasons I outlined at the beginning, there are a lot of interested stakeholders, and I think it's a very important piece of work, and certainly one that we take a lot of pride in as an organisation. We do sort of centre our reporting around the sort of three pillars of resources, people and communities, and then transparency. And within that, we sort of set out or outline our sort of goals and KPIs, and then sort of measure ourselves against those. Again, I think in the interest of transparency, you know, not every metric every year is perfect or even necessarily trending the right direction. But I think a big aspect of this, particularly when it's effectively sort of self-reporting, is making sure that you know, we're sort of transparent in what we say. We're clear where we haven't met our goals, and if we're changing our goals, either in terms of sort of the end target or the way in which we calculate it, that we're sort of transparent about those changes as well. So this just sort of gives you a flavour of sort of some of the things that we measure, a lot of which are kind of common across industries. But I think in particular, as we talk about the likes of PUE and WE, they're obviously very much, I guess, the front and centre of things from a data centre standpoint. And I guess just sort of coming on to this final slide here, and sort of PUE, which is obviously the energy consumption or energy efficiency, and then WE, which is the water efficiency. They are, I guess, without doubt, the two largest environmental sort of impacts that the data center industry has. And as my colleague talked about on as part of her sort of presentation. And the two are actually quite interlinked, and I think this is one of the things that is that's sort of often overlooked in a lot of the conversations around PUE and sort of energy efficiency, and then sort of water efficiency is the two are interlinked, and I think to some degree there is a sort of trade-off between the two. Linked into this is also sort of CapEx, so sort of cost to the operator. I think there aren't perfect solutions here, but I'll try and sort of give people a sense of sort of how the industry sort of come at this, and I guess sort of what we're doing more specifically. So just on sort of the first slide, and if you'll sort of bear with me on the sort of the consumption breakdown. So I think people will be very familiar with what we talk about with sort of PUE or sort of energy efficiency. So yeah, a good and very efficient data center will perhaps have a PUE of 1.3 times or 1.30 times. I guess the first and most important thing that sort of gets lost in a lot of kind of conversations around this, as you look at sort of decomposing that. So 1.0 times of that is actually customer consumption. So whether that's sort of enterprises, whether that's kind of you know, the cloud, or sort of more recently AI, that's customer own consumption. And that consumption is obviously significantly increasing, but that's sort of just servicing the end customer server requirements. So sort of big part of what's driving sort of demand in our own data center consumption is that end customer consumption, I guess their own efficiencies in terms of chip power consumption. Overlaying on top of that, I guess sort of going from the 1.0 to the 1.3 times is sort of where we as data center operators really play. So that 0.3 times. And that really breaks into kind of two parts. So 0.5 times is sort of UPS. So this is a lot of the redundancy, so the power redundancy, and sort of the requirements there. So that's sort of energy loss through that system. Look, the easiest way to kind of get improve the efficiency of that, and there have been a lot of efficiency gains, is to sort of change the requirements for redundancy. So some customers are willing to do that, some customers aren't. But as data center operators, we do have an obligation on ourselves to try and drive the efficiency there. And I'd say over the last sort of 5 or 10 years, the efficiency there has probably increased by a factor of 2. But by far and away, sort of the biggest driver here is sort of cooling and building. And really, within that, it's all about cooling. So it's all about optimizing the temperature at which these end customers are operating their equipment. Again, first and foremost, the best way or the most sort of efficient way to reduce that the energy consumption there is just to increase the temperature of the operating environment. Look, there are safe guidelines provided by chip operators. Different customers have requirements there. But increasing that temperature and that environment is sort of first and foremost a way to sort of be driving efficiency. But within that, and assuming that these goalposts are sort of set in terms of actually what the requirements are from the DC operator to provide as sort of operating parameters, you then get onto the cooling technology. And within this, look, there are various different cooling technologies available. The most common one is sort of air-cooled technology. It's also the most simple. It's similar to it's a more sophisticated version of sort of what you see in your own apartments. For those of you who've got air conditioning, it doesn't actually use water. So on one hand, it gets a big tick because it doesn't use water as part of the air cooling. But on the other, it's actually the least efficient of the sort of the cooling technologies from a power standpoint. Water cooling technology does, as the name suggests, use water cooling as part of sort of the evaporation technology. It does have a greater energy efficiency, but does use an enormous amount more water. At Digital Edge, we've been putting a lot of investment and I guess money where our mouth is in terms of an alternative type of cooling, which we call SPLC, but is really kind of a closed loop technology. Which does utilize water, but effectively that water is sort of recycled through the system rather than the majority being passed out. So water consumption is about 20% less than than a standard water cooled technology. And the PUEs you see here, so 2 recently commissioned sites, one in Jakarta and one in Manila, both of which commissioned across the last 18 months. And PUEs well below that of sort of water cooled technology. Yeah, that does come at a price, and that price is really on sort of the capex side, so that you're trading a higher upfront capex for lower, I guess, ongoing operating costs and a reduced environmental impact. But that trade-off is there, and I guess that's a trade-off that data center operators and sort of end customers are constantly sort of working through in terms of calculus. But certainly from a Digital Edge standpoint, and for the reasons that we'll sort of chat about as we go through this panel discussion, I think this is only going to become a more important issue, and it's one that we're sort of firmly committed to investing in and standing behind in terms of the technologies. So, look, thanks very much for the invitation to participate today, and very much looking forward to the panel discussion and questions. So please feel free to submit those.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was fantastic. We appreciate your sharing and the challenges you face, and we look forward to reading that ESG report you're going to submit publish next month. Now for the panel, and here's where I'll hand over to our moderator, Ronald Young. Ronald, over to you.
Thanks, Chen. So I'm Ronald Young. I'm the head of sustainable finance for Asia at SG. I'm the moderator of today's panel. So from the presentation, we got a very good sense of what are the key sustainability challenges of the industry and how they're resolving those. So maybe for this panel, let me start with Jason. So from your perspective as a sustainability consultant, what drivers do you see with your data center clients to push for sustainability improvement? For example, to decarbonize. So what are the key drivers that you see?
Yeah, thank you, Ronald. So I see two main drivers, one around customers and one around investors. So for customers, many of the customers will have their own sustainability targets, requiring them to take action in their supply chain and scope 3 emissions. And as a result, some companies have made it quite easy for customers to be able to track their scope 3 emissions through their data platforms. And the question and pressure will always be coming to decarbonize data centers' scope 1 and 2 emissions, as the customer scope 3 is oftentimes part of a net zero or a science-based target that has been set. For investors, mostly looking to avoid ESG-related risks, including those around greenhouse gas emissions, water, human rights, health and safety, energy usage, all of those kind of typical ESG topics. And generally, customers and investors will tend to want to do business with more sustainable companies. And so when looking at new data center developments, even the ones in construction and operation phase, we mostly see issues around energy usage, water usage, and importantly, community management. And so communities around data centers will oftentimes may protest against data center developments due to its high energy and water usage. And so in this aspect as well, it's important from a community relations point of view to show that the use of renewables or clean power, water recycling and replenishment were ways that the data center development would benefit the community in order to have a better understanding of the purpose of data centers and how they can benefit. And lastly, in many jurisdictions, the management of climate-related risks and opportunities under the TCFD framework, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is now merged in with the ISSB, or the International Sustainability Standards Board, will identify the introduction of climate regulations as a material transition risk for many companies. And so then this will naturally cause companies to look at increasing energy efficiency and switching to renewables as examples as effective ways of mitigating that risk.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So, Jonathan, from an operator and investor's perspective, what is your experience? Do you see the same drivers? And what are the key internal and external challenges to achieve improvement in the industry?
Yeah, look, I'd agree with Jason's comments there, and I touched on some of the presentation, so I won't sort of rehash it. But across the drivers, obviously, there's the sort of the customer angle. There's a sort of straight commercial sort of cost dimension to it, and then sort of there's the broader stakeholder environment. Whether it's end equity investors, debt providers, or sort of local communities and governments. I think sort of on the challenges side, I think the one I'd sort of highlight, and I touched on the presentation, is obviously we're sort of faced with enormous sort of growing demand from kind of end customers, which is a great thing for the industry. But that demand is coming sort of thick and fast. And I think furthermore, particularly kind of with cloud and then more recently the advent of sort of AI, the demand requirement changes are moving incredibly quickly. I think within the chip industry that change is going enormously quickly. And then from a sort of DC operator standpoint, we're sort of then one step removed and trying to plan 20-year infrastructure around some of these developments that are literally happening in the space of months. So I think sort of first and foremost, I'd say that's sort of the biggest requirement. Some of these things are hard to solve, and even in a static environment, particularly given some of the trade-offs, much harder when you haven't got sort of particularly kind of clear roadmap. And I think the other one I'd just touch on is, particularly with regards to energy procurement. And if a lot of the solution here alongside efficiency is going to be, I guess, getting into additive renewable power, that is a challenge in itself, and one which, as I touched on, it does take some problem solving in terms of sort of tailoring solutions to end data center demand.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So indeed, renewable power procurement is a very important lever, because like scope 2, the GHG emissions associated with the electricity supply of the data center is very meaningful for the industry. Yeah. So apart from basically trying to procure renewable power, is there any other way, or have you considered any other way to go with managing your scope 2 emissions, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. We have. Look, I mean, I think sort of one of the simpler ways of doing it is sort of carbon offsets or sort of purchasing carbon credits. I think so depending on where you're at in the journey, that probably is regarded as being sort of less progressive than something that's additive in terms of kind of end you know helping add to I guess sort of the end bank of sort of renewable power. And I think honestly that's the way the market's going to go. I think kind of the complications there are from a DC operator are obviously sort of thinking about, how do we feel about kind of fixing our cost of power, for 5, 10, 15 years versus where our competitors in the market may be at. What does that look like from kind of a load standpoint, and shaping load versus what we've got on the demand side. And then even simple things like, a lot of data center projects are developed on sort of a non-recourse project basis. How does an entity like that contract or have kind of credit standard to contract with a 15-year PPA with a power provider? So I think that's sort of the end game, so the interim game, I guess, of some of the interim solutions, particularly on the likes of sort of carbon, of sort of buying credits or sort of partnering with local providers. And we've done that in Indonesia, where we're 100% sort of green provider, and even places like China where that's available as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So let me turn to Darisha. So do you hear the same from the industry when you're compiling your research paper? Would you like to add to what Jason and Jonathan have said?
Thanks, Ronald. So actually, when we wrote this report, we just used information that we could find on so secondary information. So whether it's through annual reports, sustainability reports, CDP, Bloomberg, press releases, websites, wherever we could find it. It was quite painful, but that's how we compiled the report. But since we published it, we've also had some conversations with players. But also we have seen what players in, let's say, Silicon Valley players have been doing. And when it comes to renewable energy, it's complicated. A lot of them are doing things like on-site renewables, off-site, green certificates, and I think the biggest is green PPAs. But there is a complexity to that because, especially if you're in Asia, there's a premium for it, and I think there's a premium in a lot of places because there's so much demand now, and the infrastructure isn't quite there yet. So there's not enough for a lot of these companies to be able to use all green PPAs for all of their energy needs. And also what a lot of them are trying to do is get these longer term agreements in place, but those aren't always easy to find. And I think Johnson touched on this. How are you going to put these agreements in place? Do you actually want these long-term agreements? Yes, you do, because then the utilities can go and invest in renewables, but do you know how much electricity you're going to need in the long term? Well, given the sector's growth, you're probably going to need more, so that does help in a way, but it is definitely a complexity to that, and that's what we've heard from the players that we've been speaking to. But Ronald, I hope you don't mind, but I have a question for Jonathan, which is more on looking at renewables or anything that you're doing in terms of PUE or WUE. If there's regulatory pressure you've been feeling, or even regulatory incentives to help you along that way to improve all of that.
This wasn't part of the preparation.
Sorry.
I think at the moment there aren't explicit regulatory pressures. To be honest, I think this is, from our standpoint, this is more about kind of getting ahead of it, because I think by the time those pressures come around, as I say, if you've got sort of invested infrastructure in the ground and it's sort of 15, 20-year infrastructure, then you're kind of going to have problems. So I think it's less around that. I think the stakeholders who are most explicit about this are the customers, and I guess more specifically, the US hyperscalers, who are incredibly prescriptive on it. And I think also, to their credit, chatting about what people are doing, I think if you want to look at sort of who's most progressive on this, it's honestly not the colo operators at the moment. It's Microsoft and Amazon, and they're doing some pretty amazing and sort of progressive things. in this area, and I think it's worth having a look at. I think some of it's not going to work out, some of it will, but I think it's a pretty good guide for industry as to where we're ultimately going to need to be aspiring to as co-operators.
Okay, thank you, Dorisha and Jonathan. So I'm a sustainable finance banker, and I've often been requested to consider sustainable finance solutions for data centers and help them to drive towards improvement. Now, I've also been asked, like generally, how financiers or financial markets can assist in this aspect. So maybe let me start with explaining what are sustainable finance solutions. Yeah, so there are two main categories of sustainable finance solutions, namely use of proceeds, so like green or social financing instruments, and sustainability link. So both would include bonds, loans, and other types of financing instruments. So in terms of use of proceeds, taking green loan as an example, the proceeds of the loan will have to be applied on green investments. So for example, like energy efficiency investments or renewable energy, which we mentioned is closely related to the energy supply of data center, and clean transportation. And in terms of sustainability link, taking sustainability linked loan as an example, the proceeds from the loan can be for general corporate purpose, but the financing cost of the loan would have to vary based on the sustainability performance of the borrower. So for instance, if the issuer established a set of sustainability KPIs and targets and subsequently meet those targets, then the financing cost for the borrower under the loan could be reduced. So after talking about the general what are sustainable finance solutions, then I'll ask the question of like, how can these sustainable finance solutions be applied to data centers? So actually, from what I've seen, both use of proceeds and sustainability linked solutions have been used on data center projects and companies. For greenfield data center project, green loan is more common than sustainability linked loan. Given the project has yet to be built and there are no historical operating data to serve as a baseline in helping to set future targets. And for operating data center projects, both green loan and sustainability linked loan has been seen in the market. So for data center data center companies with a portfolio of projects, so I'm talking about not a single project, but a company, an operating company with a portfolio of projects, then what I've seen is sustainability linked loans are better suited given the diversity of the assets, because the assets could have different like energy efficiency or water efficiency. So some might be green and some might not be. So a sustainability linked loan is actually more suitable and more commonly seen in these cases. So, but actually we talk about the potential structure for data center, but then not all projects and companies are well suited for a green loan or a sustainability linked loan. So when structuring, we would have to start with considering the corporate sustainability and climate strategy. And on top of that, we will also have to look at the sustainability aspects of the asset. So Jonathan mentioned like energy efficiency and water efficiency, those are key. And Jonathan also mentioned like the cooling system. So for our considerations, we'll have to look at energy consumption, which is highly related to the energy efficiency of the data center. We have to look at energy sourcing. So what is the current fuel mix of the source? And will there be any plan to install on-site renewable power in the future? Or as Jonathan mentioned, are there any PPA with renewable energy suppliers that could offset the power? And then also in terms of cooling system, so we'll ask the question on like whether it's water or air cooling. Actually, there's no one preference to the other. It will have to depend on the circumstances. And then basically, and also like the consideration will have to be balanced by water consumption versus like availability consideration. And there are other considerations in terms of like the ESG aspects of the data center. For example, like the location, the siting, and then whether there was like pre-settlement associated with the construction of the data center. Yeah. So maybe just talk a bit more about like the criteria for structuring a green loan. So Jonathan mentioned PUE. It is a very important criteria for considering whether an asset could be labeled as green or not. And in some jurisdictions, the taxonomy would require extra requirement, such as water usage efficiency. And just quickly about sustainability linked loan for data center. So KPIs we have seen in the market include PUE, and they include water usage effectiveness, like the water efficiency of the data center. And we have also seen a carbon usage effectiveness, which is actually a measure for the carbon intensity of electricity used at the data center site. So these are all like key sustainability attributes of the data center. And then the market would like to see it improving over time under sustainability linked financing structure when there's one. So on top of this primary KPIs, then we have seen like social KPIs such as gender diversity. It can also be added to the structure. So after we spoke about financing, so let me turn back to the other panelists for them to talk about non-financial solutions. So maybe let me go back to Jason. So what practical solutions do data center companies have to manage these sustainability and decarbonization challenges? For example, like data management or decarbonization options, and what are some examples of these solutions, and how do those actually help?
Yeah, sure. So, on the hardware side, it, goes more into the physical aspects of the data center. Operational emissions, this would be measures such as more efficient cooling systems, rooftop solar, power purchase agreements, better insulation, even using batteries for backup power instead of diesel generators. For construction phase, this would be around building design standards and reducing the embodied carbon emissions. So such as using low carbon materials like timber, green steel, green cement, but also taking into account the transportation emissions of procuring those materials to the site. And not to mention, the potential cost differential in many of those cases. You may be paying a premium for those types of materials, and then those materials may not even be available in this part of the world at the moment. On the software side, mentioning like on data management, it is useful to have a system to be able to track energy usage on a live basis. It could cover not only carbon, but even multiple sustainability areas, such as water usage, like we've mentioned here today. And there are also programs out there that can help optimize performance. So looking at the live performance and helping optimize, kind of on a live basis to make sure that your energy and water usage is minimized and optimized as possible. Now, Jonathan mentioned this a little bit earlier. If you have the luxury of building a new data center, it'd be ideal to put it in location within a jurisdiction that's more, straightforward to be able to procure renewable energy and having fewer of these kinds of sustainability challenges around, energy, carbon, and water. But most companies we find will typically build data centers with a customer demand first and reliability approach, which is very understandable and what we're seeing, especially with the growth of AI and the use of data. But at least understanding what the renewable energy landscape is ahead of time can sometimes save some effort down the road when trying to later meet decarbonization targets, such as doing some advanced market studies in this space, and where you do plan on building and where you do see the customer demand for the need of data centers. And then furthermore, as been touched on here as well, many companies are looking into investing in renewable energy, though this is quite challenging in Asia for a number of reasons. In order to really meaningfully decarbonize your operations, it'd be important to generate renewable power and have PPAs in the same geography as your operations. But in some places, particularly in, say, Singapore and Hong Kong, the lack of land mass makes it very difficult to generate renewable energy at scale. And most places in Asia will still be using coal to generate electricity. And for Scope 2, there's pressure on the power grids to decarbonize for companies to meet their decarbonization targets. And also the physical features or regulations in other countries may make it difficult to produce meaningful renewable energy at scale. And so lastly, there are also some emerging technologies, such as battery energy and storage systems, or BESS, that may assist in decarbonization in the future. But however, it seems like these technologies to be used at scale still seem to be pretty far out.
Okay, so I got disconnected for a short while. So I suppose you have finished responding to my questions. So let me thank you, Jason. So let's go back to Jonathan. So what type of infrastructure solutions that data center developer operator like yourself are implementing to make it more sustainable and helping to decarbonize? And from your experience, like how does sustainable finance mentioned by me and practical solutions mentioned by Jason would help?
Okay, there's a lot in there. I'll try and keep this sort of short, so I'm not dominating the conversation. I think on sort of the financing side, I think this is a big and emerging area, as you sort of rightly touched on. It's one we spent a lot of time, and actually last year we did our first green loan. Actually, it was the first green loan for the market, so that was in South Korea. So it was about a 340 million US dollar equivalent loan size. And I guess, Ronald, as you'd sort of touched on that, the sort of metrics on that, given that was a new build site, so a 36 megawatt data center, were really around specific, I guess, so the energy efficiency of that building and ensuring that that complied with what was sort of deemed green loan. Look, I think it was sort of the right thing to do. It obviously sort of had great benefits from a profile standpoint, but I guess also from a cost of financing, although there was a lot of some additional work there involved in it, and in that case, actually educating a lot of the local lenders who hadn't come across it before. Ultimately, I think we were able to access pricing and even pricing baskets within the same lenders, particularly the international ones, that was better than otherwise if it hadn't been deemed a green loan. And I think that's only going to sort of increase or sort of get more accentuated over time. Jumping to the other part of your question, Ronald, and just sort of very quickly, I guess, in terms of initiatives, I'm not going to sort of give lots of answers here and chew up the time, but I guess to sort of to frame things for people, what I've spoken about on sort of PUE and WE is obviously all in relation to sort of the data center once it sort of hit operations. And I guess the reason why that dominates the conversation is twofold. Firstly, you're dealing with that kind of 15 or 20-year asset. So it's sort of a long time. Secondly, they are kind of high impact and pretty objective measurements and ways of sort of looking at efficiency and I guess sort of environmental impact. I guess the other side of the coin, we haven't spoken about, but is equally as important, I guess, is sort of the environmental impact and kind of initiatives underway to deliver that physical asset as of sort of the commissioning date. And I guess that is really around kind of the design process and the procurement process leading into construction of that physical asset. And that's everything from thinking about, selection of materials, recycling, specification, and even construction processes as well. And, going right through to things like the use of concrete and sort of the impact of that, which I'm sure people are very well aware of. So I think that in itself is a whole different conversation. It's honestly a more complicated one, but I think it's going to increasingly start getting a lot more sort of focus as well. And I think the industry is going to have to, become better at sort of how we articulate the challenges there and what we're doing there. We're obviously at Digital Edge, we're doing everything from sort of LED gold building certifications to looking at sort of the use of recycled materials. There's no one-shot solution here, but I think for people here in the audience today, I think it's one to encourage people to be thinking about because it certainly is going to be coming to the forefront, and I guess it's a much less simple area than some of the other topics that we've spoken about.
Thank you, Jonathan, and also thanks Jason and Darisha on the insightful sharing. So I'm conscious of time, and then we see a few questions on the chat box. So maybe I'll raise those questions and see if the panelists would like to answer those. Yeah, so the first question is about the CWR report. So the audience, basically the person, he has not read the report, but then he would like to understand what the 5 Chinese issuers did use for their green bond proceeds. For example, like if it's not renewables, then what are those? What are the main use of the green bond proceeds? So maybe Derecha, would you like to take this one?
Yep, thanks, Ronald, and thank you very much for the question. So the main use of proceeds was actually tied to the PUE. As Jonathan was talking about, it is very important. So most of the funds went to energy efficiency and for green buildings, but also some of it did go for clean transport as well. So that shows you how the PUE numbers are quite important, especially because we're looking at Chinese companies here. In China, the regulator actually has targets for PUE, which has to be taken into consideration, and the data center industry itself is now being called is termed a dual high industry and is classified similar to cement and steel in China. And a lot of this is covered in the report, so please do go have a look at that.
Thank you. So there's a second question. So one audience is asking like, where can we get the info on PUE, WUE, and GWP for specific data center development project? And if the project has achieved green building certification. Yeah. So I think maybe I'll take the first part of the question. So, for PUE, at least like in Singapore, there's a Singapore taxonomy. And in the taxonomy, it talks about basically what would be the requirement for a data center to be green. And then it makes specific reference to some of the local certification. And it also like include like some numbers in terms of PUE associated with the local certification. So I think at least for a Singapore building certification for data center, the Singapore taxonomy is a source to get reference from. And then in terms of the other certification, I'm wondering like if maybe Jason or Jonathan have seen like any certification and then there's a specific PUE or WUE associated with the certification.
Quickly go. I mean, I do know like LEED, for example, a lot of the companies are trying to get LEED Gold or Platinum for their data center operations. But to be honest, I'm not sure if there's like a benchmark kind of PUE or WE that's associated with that. Maybe Jonathan, I can turn that to you.
Yeah, look, I think these are good questions. They're not easy ones to answer. There is not an industry consensus on a lot of this. So, as Ronald said, Singapore government's been quite explicit on it. Other governments have got certain parameters or sort of frameworks that differ from it, and then the vast majority of governments just don't say anything on it at all. And then you've got sort of independent sort of certification bodies who sort of have their own frameworks. If you get onto the financing side, those frameworks are typically developed in conjunction with sort of financing banks. So you're really looking at, I guess, selecting and working with banks who've got a lot of pedigree and experience, probably in Europe, which is the most advanced market, and they're almost then kind of self-certifying. So this is why I think that this is such a sort of problematic area, which is outside of PUE and WE, which can both be quite explicitly measured, but actually are then kind of interlinked and almost kind of inversely linked. There is a lot of sort of subjectivity in terms of what metrics to include and how they're measured, and there's not sort of a broad industry consensus. If you're wanting information specifically on projects, look, the listed companies, and again, particularly the US and Australian listed DC and European DC operators have got very good sort of disclosure, sometimes downright to sort of the project level as to what they've got. Some of the other markets perhaps less so, but I think that's probably a very good place to start.
Yeah, I concur with Jonathan. So there are lots of subjectivity in this. So if you look at different taxonomies, there could be different PUEs, threshold as a threshold requirement. And then if you talk to different second-party opinion providers, then they could give you different numbers as well. Yeah. So this is an evolving space. Yeah. So and then I see that it's time already. So maybe let me pass it back to Chun for the closing.
Thanks, Ronald, Dorisha, Jonathan, and Jason. That was a really great session and an excellent introduction to the importance of this agenda, one which is only really going to grow. We appreciate you sharing some of the solutions we need to consider in addressing the challenges and the complexity of how to decarbonize these key assets and investments, as well as sharing the financial instruments and structuring options that are a critical part of the conversation. Sam Altman of OpenAI himself has been warning that the growth in AI will need to consume far more power than we expect, and yet that need has still to be fully appreciated. So again, thank you to our distinguished panelists for bringing the issue to the forefront in this webinar. Once again, for those seeking to claim CPT points, please remember to complete the survey at the end. And if you enjoyed today's session, please enjoy our next webinar on gender diversity in action, developments and challenges in APAC on the 27th of March, co-organized by HKGFA and Sustainable Fitch, and also our biodiversity-related reporting, target setting frameworks and taxonomies training sessions on 11th of April. Please also follow us on our website and social media for more HKGFA events.